Hey everybody, welcome to the Blendr Report. I'm your host, Liam DeBoer, and today we are joined by a very special guest, Eric Kaufmann, a Canadian professor of politics at the University of Buckingham, director of the Center for Heterodox Social Science, a Manhattan Institute fellow, and an instructor with Peterson Academy where he teaches political ideologies. He's the author of major works like White Shift, Shall the Religious Inherit the Earth, and The Rise and Fall of Anglo-America, books that have shaped global conversations about immigration, culture, and the future of Western societies. So thanks for joining us here today, Eric.
Great to be here, Liam.
So I just thought maybe we'd start off by giving a quick overview. There's definitely been a rising sentiment within the nationalism across the world. And so I just wanted to dive into these ideas. First and foremost, like, what is nationalism and ethnicity? How are these ideas defined? And then we can get into a little bit more discussion there.
Yeah, good. And I'll sort of, not wanting to repeat too much from the Peterson course, but, very basically, nation is a territorial community which has some kind of political aspirations. It might be independence, but it could be something like autonomy. So it's a political, historical, territorial community. Ethnicity is about a community that believes itself to be descended from common ancestors, and it usually tells itself apart from other ethnic communities through the use of one of racial appearance, religion, or language, or some combination of those. Not always, but generally those. One or more of those three, only has to have one of those. That's what ethnicity is. Now, of course, ethnic groups are often associated with a particular homeland that they claim to have originated from. So there is a territorial aspect, but ethnic groups can be like Jews. They can be scattered into a diaspora, whereas a nation must occupy a historic territory, must be territorialized. That's kind of the basic of what a nation and an ethnic group is. You then have nationalism, which can take a number of forms. One is political, like separatism, Quebec separatism, for example. Another could be cultural, if you think of the Welsh wanting to preserve their language, or it could be, in fact, to do with ethnocultural, wanting to sort of prevent ethnic transformation within the country. Those are all aspects of nationalism, but it also could be really about national pride and humiliation. We, China, were humiliated in the 19th century. We want our pride back. We're going to flex our muscles. That kind of pride humiliation aspect is another part of it. So that really, in a very quick nutshell, is what nationalism is.
And so how do you see this idea playing out in the modern world? Because growing up, I didn't think too much of nationalism, what it meant to be a nation. I didn't concern myself with this all that much. But then you saw throughout the 2010s, where I first kind of came on to the idea was reading the first article by Trudeau in the New York Times. And it was about a month after he had got elected, and he declared Canada the first post-national state in the world. And so where do you see nationalities and this idea in the modern world? How does it fit into the current political discussions, and where do you think it ends up going?
Yeah, the first thing I'd say is that discussions of Canadian nationalism have been continuous through my lifetime, right? So I think what you're pointing to is a certain threat to traditional sense of Canadian national identity from what I'll call the cultural left. What I would say is that I think the cultural left actually has a version of Canadian national identity Justin Trudeau has a version of Canadian national identity, and we can see that now with the Liberal Party and the way when it comes to American 51st state rhetoric or tariffs, they're very happy to bring out the flag and try and raise, their version of nationalism. But their version of nationalism is an anti-American nationalism. It is a left-wing version of nationalism. And even saying, look, Canada has no core culture or identity, no mainstream. What is Justin Trudeau doing there? He's saying, we in Canada are morally superior to you. in the U.S. and elsewhere because we don't need to have a mainstream culture or ethnic majority. That is a way of that is what we might call a form of missionary nationalism. That is, the highest values in the world are woke values where we're multicultural, we are ashamed and guilty of mistreating groups in the past. We're going to atone for these sins, and by doing that, we're going to just show how enlightened and virtuous we are because we're the best country. See what that is? That is sort of it's still a version of national pride, but it's national pride based on being more woke than any other country. So it's the same in a way as Iran and Saudi Arabia competing to say we are the best Muslim country. So they're really fighting over a universal value, which is Islam, just as Canada is fighting over a universal value, which is cultural socialism or wokeness. And that is what they're proud of in their nationhood. So that's what I'd say, is that these are actually competing versions of national identity that are clashing, rather than thinking about national identity versus non-nationhood. Now, there are some non-nationhoods. There is ISIS, for example, which wanted to erase national borders. I don't think that's exactly what the Trudeau project is. It's much more of a kind of reconfiguration of nationhood to make it Canadian nationhood be defined by cultural leftism.
Yeah, and so when it comes to this, I think, when I was taking your lecture on the Peterson Academy, I realized that this kind of fits into that more modernist view, right? Would you say that the more modern left-wing view of nationalism would be that really it's just a sentiment that's created by elites and for economic purposes? And I kind of see this, at least, maybe I'm not correct here, but I see this kind of playing out where, okay, if you accept that view that nationalism is just manufactured, then you play within that frame. So you're kind of essentially creating the rules to the game that you're about to play. And that's kind of what we've been seeing here over the last little bit, to what you were pointing about with the rhetoric about Americanism, is that when nationalism becomes a useful tool, we'll invoke it. But then when we actually don't need it, we're going to try to go against the idea itself. But is that kind of, am I on the right line there?
Look, I would say that there's the analytical framework, the theories of nationalism, which you mentioned modernism, which is this idea that politics comes first, the culture is derivative, and therefore it's state elites who really matter, or state functions that matter. The national identity is kind of just this made-up appendage designed to further state ambition. The ethno-symbolist argument, however, is that attachments to symbols, myths, memories are deeply rooted, and it's not so easy to remake a country's national identity. I don't think those things automatically map directly to political positions. This is more a way of analyzing nationhood. So, for example, if Justin Trudeau is trying to remake, or like his father did, to remake Canada as a left-wing country, and its identity be we are the most culturally left-wing country in the world, you could say, well, that's an instrumental project. That's just serving the interests of Pierre and Justin, and I don't think they would be very thrilled to hear that message, right? So clearly, I would try and separate the analytical a little bit from the political, is what I would say. I mean, I think we could analyze these things different ways. We can analyze the Justin Trudeau project through instrumental, like it's about getting Justin Trudeau ahead. That would be an instrumental take on Trudeau's version of Canadianism. The ethno-symbolism, generally I think is difficult for the left to easily swallow. Perhaps the exception being where they're defending a minority form of nationalism, say Indigenous, where they would say, they are descended, from time immemorial. They've been talking about Turtle Island from time immemorial, and so they wouldn't want you to go in and say, yeah, Turtle Island is an invented tradition. Your sense that you were on the land for thousands of years is an invention. It's nothing real. It's something that you made up recently. So that kind of a modernist take would be very sort of anathema to the cultural left. So what I would say is I want to try and separate out the analytical frame, modernist ethno-symbolist,
Right.
of looking at nationalism from politics, which I think uses these things in many different ways.
I mean, my personal view on it would be that there's probably a mix of the two. I tend not to be an absolutist in any domain, whether it be this conversation or any other, in that you probably do have multiple forces from both, right? That you've got certain elements that do come forward from that, say, more ethno-symbolist heritage, shared symbols, values, religion, language, and so forth. And then you've also probably got the political elite that are trying to shape it as well. And then, the reality itself that comes out and that we all experience is kind of the meshing of these two. Would that be more or less on like how you see things as well? Or
yeah, I think that's true. I think, but I would say it depends on the situation. In some cases, I'd say the ethno-symbolism is very dominant. And in other cases, I'd say the modernism is more dominant. So if you think about the formation of the United States, but particularly the Latin American countries, the Venezuelas and Colombias, Mexico, these places that as they were emerging in the early 19th century, they had very shallow memories in the land. They didn't really have traditions for the most part. And so you could say, yeah, this is probably about various elites and counter elites fighting it out to control power and territory. I think that's makes a lot of sense for those early New World nationalism. Whereas if we were talking about Armenian, Greek, let's just say, I don't know, I'm trying to think, Israel, Palestine, some of these places, I would say where there are deeper layers of symbolic construction that have been going on for a very long time, I think the modernist case is weaker. So
okay.
Where I would say there's kind of a richer, deeper kind of cultural, symbolic narrative, deeper attachments, then I think the modernist claims are harder to sustain. But whether it's a shallower history, generally, not always, but often, I'd say the modernist claim looks stronger. So yeah, I think it partly depends where we're talking about, when we're talking about, as to which one is more dominant.
Right. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. What do you make of this kind of rise in nationalist sentiment, whether it be the UK, America, and so forth? It is definitely becoming more. I don't know if I've kind of picked up whether that's taking hold in the political arenas or the academic, but definitely on the ground. Like even for instance, in my day to day, when I come across people. Not that they would articulate it in a very academic way, but they're definitely starting to kind of see things through that lens a little bit, and I can see those ideas starting to come through. Do you think that this is like where do you think that this ends up going? Do you think that this is going to continue down that path? Do you think that there'll be pushback against it? What's your thoughts on those kind of movements across the West now?
Well, I think that what we're seeing is a specific kind of nationalism emerging in the West, which is really about cultural nationalism. It's about immigration and ethnic transformation and religious transformation. So we're not really seeing a surge in separatist movements. I mean, in a way, Quebec separatism peaks, in the mid-90s, and Scottish separatism they had their referendum in the 2010s. I think that kind of nationalism is, I think, actually losing force. And the more cultural or ethnocultural nationalism, which is defensive, which says, actually, the pace of cultural and ethnic change is too quick for assimilation. This is disorienting. We don't recognize our country anymore. That is what's behind national populism in the West. The number one question is around, do you want immigration reduced? How important is immigration for you as an issue? If it is a top issue for you and you want it reduced, you are much, much, much more likely to be a populist voter. And that doesn't matter if we're talking about the AFD in Germany, Reform in Britain, Sweden Democrats in Sweden, Donald Trump in the United States. All of them are the same. I'll give you a couple of numbers here. There was the AFD vote. The AFD voters in Bavaria in the last Bavarian state election, 100% of them agreed with the statement, Germany is gradually losing its culture. Sweden Democrat voters, sort of well over 90% said immigration is too high in Sweden. Just overwhelmingly, the correlation is around that issue. So that's really and then you also have, of course, maybe for people who are more online, the way the institutions have gone during what's known as the Great Awakening. What's happened is the cultural left has become more aggressive. Now, the thing is, I don't think this has just happened in the 2010s. I think it has been building for decades since the 1960s, but it reached a peak with George Floyd, or in Canada with the whole Kamloops 250 mass graves hoax. I'm afraid to say that's what it was. That all of these sort of moral hysterias, that represented the peak of a 60-year movement of cultural progressivism, which had become more and more fundamentalist. So one of the things it does, of course, is it attacks the history of the country, built on stolen land, had an empire, you're a settler colonizer, you racist, misogynist, all this kind of stuff is a way of delegitimizing the traditional national identity of most of the population. You have these attacks. Now, they're mainly happening in schools and universities and, the healthcare system and other government institutions, maybe corporations as well. So they are out of view for a lot of ordinary Canadians, let's say. But I think this is a contributing factor. There's a backlash against this attempt to essentially deconstruct and guilt trip the majority tradition. And so I think there's a combination of things going on. I think the immigration thing is the main driver, but I think that culture wars is a sort of second level that is contributing as well to this rise of what I would call cultural nationalism. It's not really political nationalism in any serious way, even though I understand the Brexit vote was partly about that, but even the Brexit vote was only partly about separation from the European political structures. I mean, it was that for the Brexiteer elite, the Boris Johnsons, but for the average voter, it was much more about control of borders, slowing down immigration, getting cultural control, cultural security. And one of the reasons that the Conservative Party has lost so many votes from Brexiteers is because it pretended that was not why people voted for Brexit, that they wanted to vote for free trade and for other things to do with politics and economics. And that is actually, that misunderstanding is now really the reason that the Tory party in Britain is tanking and reform is surging.
Yeah, and that's really interesting. And I think too, one of the things that I've been trying to wrap my head around is how this conversation around national identity and culture has become so wrapped up in race, in the sense where both sides now are kind of looking at it through that lens. Obviously one side is very against it, and now you have another side that's very much embracing it. But I look at it, and like my family, for instance, came from Ireland. And, when there was a lot of Irish immigrants coming over to Canada and America back in those days, you would often see the same kind of sentiments now, say, push back against those people that are coming in. They were seen as a rowdy bunch, wanting to drink all the time. They weren't assimilating into the culture, but it was never about race. It was always about culture. But now, because of where that immigration seems to be stemming from, because it's not European countries immigrating to, say, North America or vice versa, then it does kind of bring into this race element. So I guess what I'm asking is, do you see that the whole racial conversation is more so a proxy for something deeper and more underlying, or do you think that is really a factor in this conversation?
Well, I think that, first of all, it's worth saying that nations like Canada, for example, or Britain also have dominant ethnic groups that were involved in establishing establishing and founding the nation. So in the case of Britain, it would be the ethnic English, and Germany, the ethnic Germans. Now, they may not even have thought of themselves in those terms, but you have actually this ethnic dominant group, majority group within these societies. Now, it tends to be assimilative, so there has been a melting pot into that group through intermarriage and through cultural assimilation. However, the rate of deep assimilation is always is slow. In the U.S., it took like 3-4 generations to fully meld the Southern Eastern European Catholics and Jews into the sort of majority group. Whereas the rate of ethnic shifting is now so quick, partly because the birth rates of the ethnic majority are lower, whereas in the U.S., for example, there was high immigration in the 19th, 20th century, but the native birth rates were high enough that when there was a pause, the foreign-born share dropped quite quickly. And so that's no longer the case. So you're getting this rising foreign-born share now, unprecedented levels in Canada, Australia. It's about a quarter of the population. In the major cities, it's like half. So there is just this immigration and diversity overwhelming the processes of assimilation, and that really is leading to the sense of disorientation. And so I think it's as simple as that. And I think race. Look, I think when it was the Irish coming into the U.S. in the 1850s, the big dividing line was Protestant Catholic. It wasn't obviously skin color.
Right.
Skin color is more important now simply because that's the nature of who's coming and who's already here. Islam is also an issue in Europe more to religion, but I still think it's partly what are the markers that distinguish the established ethnic group or pan-ethnic group. So if we're talking about Canada or the U.S., this white pan-ethnic group, which is a mishmash of various groups that have intermarried to a large extent. Now, there's also now intermarriage across the racial lines, but in general, that is really where the boundary is today. Now, it may not be where the boundary is in 100 years from now, but that's where we are now, which is one of the reasons why there's a conflation now of, race with majority ethnicity, and with nationhood or alternative competing versions of nationhood. So this is not what I would call white nationalism or ethnic nationalism for the most part. So white nationalism would say you've got to be white to be an equal member of the nation and to have equal rights and privileges. I think that is everything I've seen in surveys puts that number in the low single digits, whether we're talking about Europe, whether we're talking about North America. Almost nobody adheres to that idea of kind of race purity. But there is a much larger group of people who say we want a slower level of change. We want enough time to be able to assimilate people so that the ethnic majority remains substantial. And you have to have intermarriage and you have to have identity shifting, and that takes time. So I think that position, which I would call ethno-traditional nationalism, is a much more popular position and really underlies the support for populism and even underlies polarization. The progressive left will call that racism, but I don't think actually that it is, because we're talking about the difference between advocating for race purity and just advocating for a slower pace of ethnic transformation. And the left will try and conflate those two things so that any talk of culture of ethnic transformation is immediately badged as racist, even though we know from Lawson, basically the academic consensus in psychology that attachment to your own family, ethnic group, etc., is a different disposition from hatred of outsiders. If I'm very attached to my family, it doesn't make me hate the family next door more. And if we look at survey data, so white Americans who feel warmer towards whites are not colder towards blacks or Hispanics. They're, if anything, a bit warmer towards those other groups. So part of this is just attachment to what people know, the traditional composition of the country as they grew up, as they know it, and not wanting that to be transformed out of all recognition very quickly. I think that is really ultimately what's behind this. It's not a desire to sort of, turn the clock back to, either turn the clock back or go to a time of race purity, but it is it is saying that culture, ethnicity matters, and we need to slow things down. I actually think that is more important than worries about crime and public service, pressure on hospitals, urban sprawl, housing prices, and all these other things, which are much more acceptable rationales. But actually, in experimental studies, for example, you can ask Brexit supporters how important is pressure on public services like the hospital system, and the welfare state, and so on. And you'll kind of get like 50 out of 100. All you have to say is, immigrants putting pressure on public services, and it goes to like 75. And the truth of the matter is, the part of the problem that's accounted for by immigrants must be smaller than the problem itself. So that doesn't actually make a lot of sense until you realize that what they're really worried about is immigration. Once you're worried about immigration, probably for psychological, cultural reasons, you will then take that frame and interpret a lot of other issues through that lens. It's not to say immigration doesn't put pressure on jobs and housing, public services, which it does, and house prices. So these are legitimate issues on their own, but I just think for us to ignore the cultural side of this is really to ignore what I think is largely motivating it.
Yeah, I think that's very, very on point, and kind of something that's definitely more my main concern over the current pace that we've been seeing in the last 5 to 10 years when it comes to Canada. Is there other things that make it more or less likely for assimilation, in the sense where, I think about it more in terms of, say, language or religion? These kind of things typically would, make it a lot harder to communicate. And even if you've got two different parties from two different ethnic backgrounds trying to find cohesion, well, if they can't discuss anything right off the top, then you kind of closed that whole door. But how do you see that playing in with the modern immigration levels?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think that there's probably quite rapid assimilation on language, on getting a job, and obeying social cues. So at a sort of thin level, I think assimilation works pretty well certainly in English-speaking societies. But as you point out, there might be religious differences, for example, particularly, we're seeing with Islam and particularly with certain strands of Islam, where, you can have people speaking with the same accent, speak the language well, have a job, everything else, but are on certain dimensions just very different from the majority population. That's one issue. We don't want to, the Muslim population is not yet, I would say, it's 6.5% in England and Wales. It's grown a lot. It's grown a lot in Canada through high immigration as well, but it's not quite at a very high level. But there is also this question, though, of this deeper assimilation. So there's the sort of thinner, more surface assimilation, which is important, but then there's the thicker and the deeper comradeship, which really only comes through, intermarriage and deep identity change, and that is really what's lagging a lot, well behind. And so a lot of people can say, yeah, everything works well, people aren't killing each other in the street. That's true. So that is true. If that's your measure of integration, that is absolutely right. But on the other hand, if you ask a question like, how much do you trust your neighbor? Would you return a wallet? Do you feel attached to your neighborhood? Those sorts of questions which tap into social connectedness indicate that in the more diverse areas, there is weaker trust, weaker social connectedness. So what you're getting is a sort of a society based on weaker ties with eroding interpersonal trust. Again, not leading to anarchy, not leading to violence. Let's not overblow this. But it's a different type of society that is not as close-knit, that is sort of, and that society that is not as close-knit, again, doesn't mean it's going to fall apart, but it is a lot less satisfying to certain kinds of people who are, and I don't know if that's a third or a half or a majority of the population who desire that deeper sense of community, and they're not able to find it anymore. And they may compare life today with the past when there was more of the sense of community. that kind of person is very dissatisfied with the way the country is evolving, and they are much more likely to. Is it a question like Canadian culture was better in the past? Do you agree or not? They'd be way more likely to say yes, it was better in the past. That is one of the best questions for picking out, again, someone who voted for Trump, who voted for Brexit. So there is this a significant part of the population that is feeling a bit disoriented by the kind and experiencing this loss of social cohesion. So that's really the problem, I would say. I mean, it's not. I don't think these predictions about civil war and the more dire stuff. I don't think that's really the issue, but I think it's just this kind of erosion of a kind of attachment, of a kind of national attachment and cohesion that's disturbing a lot of voters.
Yeah, I think I've even felt that on a personal level of just going like, what's the common thread here for all of us? Not necessarily, I don't feel like worried walking out of my door going to work or something like that. Like it's not like I feel like I'm in imminent danger. But it is definitely kind of that fragmentation, I guess, of just even you see that with now certain cities are becoming like, for instance, I live just up the road from Brampton, which is essentially at this point, like you go through there, the businesses don't reflect anything I would ever have seen 10, 15 years ago. And you do kind of feel out of place in your own country. And so it's more of like a confusion and lost feeling than anything on that front for me. But even I had an interesting conversation with a client of mine. I do videography and photography work day to day as well. And he immigrated here from Sweden, and he was discussing how, and he owns a business, and he was discussing how two separate groups within his business and his employees got into a little bit of a battle over this conversation. One were second or third generation Italian immigrants, and the others were first generation Indian immigrants. And the Indian immigrants were talking about how they moved to Canada for the economic opportunities, that they wanted to send money home to their families. And so that's the whole reason that they were here. And the second and third generation Italians got very offended by that because they were saying how, well, I moved here, or my family moved here because they wanted to actually become part of the society and give to it, that they admired the Canadian society and wanted to integrate and didn't just look at it as like a short-term economic opportunity as much. And then he, being a Swedish immigrant, was telling me how when he first moved here, he's like, I would talk to Canadians and ask them as what does it mean to be Canadian? I want to fit in. And he's like, I couldn't get any answers from anybody. Nobody really could tell me what it meant to be a Canadian, what your customs and your norms are. And so there does just seem to be this, as you were talking about, like fragmentation of culture. And so like, looking through, say, historical examples of that, is there historical examples of these kind of things happening? How does that usually play out in the long run?
There are historical examples of, certainly empires, imperial capitals, like Venice and Constantinople and Alexandria, and these sort of imperial capitals tended to be very ethnically mixed because people from all over the empire Rome would be another example. But of course, when these empires broke up, a lot of those peoples returned to where they were from. And you can see that in the DNA studies of, Venetians and others, which show much less diversity than you might expect. I think, in terms of nations, right, you could, clearly the U.S. had a significant melting pot of European groups, however, on a base that was Anglo-Protestant. So the white population of America, even in 1920, was about 50% from British Protestant background. Onto that base, you then had the Germans, the Irish, and other Northwestern Europeans, and then you brought in the East and Southern Europeans. That's an example. Some of the cities in the East Coast U.S. already by the turn of the 20th century were really, the WASPs were a small minority in the New Yorks and Chicagos and places like that. So that did exist in the past. And then you had assimilation, and the group kind of was reconfigured as white. That was the new majority group. It's harder to, crossing the racial boundary is trickier to find historically, right? I mean, there are island plantation societies like Trinidad, Guyana, others that have Indian and African and a number of other groups there. They haven't really coalesced into a single melting pot. The politics runs on ethnic lines in a lot of those kinds of societies. So, so we don't really have a very good idea. I mean, I think what's happening in the West is you're getting this super diversity in the cities with this global migration. And residentially, what happens is the minority groups initially land in one place. They then start to spread out. The white majorities tend to retreat all the time. So they are particularly, it's not white flight, but when they go to buy a house and have a family, they will tend to go towards an area that tends to be relatively white, if they can. I mean, it'll just depend. So you will see, for example, the areas that are, say, areas in the exurbs on the outskirts of major cities in the US or Canada will tend to have white population growth. Whereas a place like Brampton or Mississauga or in Vancouver, where I'm from, Richmond, Surrey, these kinds of places will tend to have a declining, much more rapidly declining white populations in aggregate terms. So there's a kind of flight to familiarity. It's not a flight, but it's a gradual process, and it leads then to people living separate lives in many ways. Not totally. There is intermarriage. There is interracial friendships. But if you look at the most diverse neighborhoods, like if you went to Brampton, I know actually people in Brampton who are, say, who've been there who are white. They would, if you actually looked at their friendship networks, they would be wildly unrepresentative of their neighbors compared to their neighbors. Right. So they would be very weakly connected to the majority in Brampton. And this is what I mean is you will get in the most diverse areas, the whites will tend to largely still associate with whites, even though the population might be 70, 80, 90% non-white. And so what you eventually get to are these sort of bubbles sliding past each other and kind of living apart together. Not, still cordial, still, fine, civil, but on the other hand, it's a different kind of living. Then it's more like a Dubai. It's more like, you have all these expat communities living their separate lives. That's a different type of society from a sort of, tight-knit Sweden of the 1980s. So we have to think of what kind of society we want to inhabit. I think a lot of people are not really content to live in that kind of a bubble-type society with thin ties. Others are. And in fact, the other thing is what you're seeing with this diversity is it also polarizes the white population into the group who are uncomfortable with this and the group who are either comfortable or are able to suppress those instincts and who moralize about the people who are uncomfortable about it, calling them deplorables. The so-called people who are deplorables then get really annoyed, and you're now into a culture war. So the first thing that's occurred is this diversity and the different reactions to it. The second thing that occurs is this recursive radicalization and culture war that goes on top. And it's largely dividing the white population between a group which is maybe between 10% and maybe 30% at the outside, which are the kind of cultural progressives or the woke, if you like. And then probably 50% of people, well, there's a chunk of people who are just broadly conservative, but they're not politically active. And then you have people who are really, really pissed off and alienated, who are then the motive force behind a lot of populist right.
Yeah, that's always been very weird to me as this kind of double standard that is placed upon people. Again, growing up, I never really thought about these things much. I didn't have many feelings one way or another, but then I just did feel, it's pretty hard not to pay attention when all of a sudden you're being characterized as the enemy of society, a straight white man. You're like, I should maybe pay. If all the institutions think I'm the ills of society, then maybe I should start paying attention to what's happening. But you don't see that same sentiment placed upon other groups. Like, why do you think that is? So, for instance, like you see the Khalistani movement in Canada really taking hold and starting to get political ground here even as well. And it's like, that is everything that they're concerned about in regard to, say, white people, but there's zero mainstream media, or you don't see any talk about it in the academic institutions or our political class. Right. But it is very like, okay, we are going to intermarry within our religion and race. We're also going to try to push a separatist movement. Obviously, it's on the other side of the world in India, but we're going to try to make sure that this has political power within this nation now in Canada. And so, like, where do you think that double standard comes from? Is it purposeful, or are they just trying to ignore the fact? Yeah, what's the cause there?
Yeah, I mean, this is really in the DNA of the cultural left, which has run Canada since the 60s. Its origin goes back, actually, and this is a term I use, I call it asymmetrical multiculturalism. So that basically says ethnic identity is great for minorities. They should lean in and be proud and celebrate their ethnic identity. And it's horrible for ethnic majorities who should seek to supersede their ethnic attachments, to suppress them, get beyond them, because they're awful. And that is really, so what you have is this asymmetric approach to ethnic attachment. My view is actually ethnic attachment is, to some degree, a good thing, to some degree, as long as it doesn't go too far. So all of these things in moderation, right? But there has to be a sort of single standard that you apply to all groups. If a group is allowed to advocate for its interests, that has to hold for the majority as well as minorities. If a group wants to celebrate its culture, be proud of its achievements, whatever, that has to be one standard for all groups, not a double standard. But it is a double standard, and that really can be traced back to the first multicultural intellectuals in the 1910s in America, at a time when you were getting a lot of immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe who were not Protestant. An individual who is really, I would argue, the founder of this is somebody called Randolph Bourne, who was a Bohemian left liberal intellectual from New York's Greenwich Village in the sort of mid 1910s. And his argument basically was, well, the WASPs are kind of repressed. We're doing prohibition. We have no culture. We don't dance. We don't drink. Some of that was true, by the way. But in any case, that was the argument. Okay, we have no culture. All these groups are really exciting. And that's what America needs to be, is this exciting multicultural thing. Those groups should retain their culture. They shouldn't assimilate, where the WASPs should seek to be cosmopolitans. So he was pretty open about that. Now, what that version of asymmetrical multiculturalism did, it set the template. You can look at Canadian multiculturalism in the 60s, 70s, 80s, which was basically, I would say, rerunning that same script. And I think was indirectly influenced by that line of thinking anyway. So actually, Canadian multiculturalism is an American invention. But in any case, what occurs then is you start to get a second layer, which is like, well, not only is the ethnic majority boring and have no culture, but it is also oppressive. And it's racist. And that comes in the 60s. And then that's another layer that's added on top. So the multiculturalism always had this kind of leftist edge to it, despite, and it was a very successful sales pitch. A lot of Canadians fell for it. Again, going back to the 1971 Multiculturalism Act. This becomes part of this new invented tradition of Canadian identity from the 60s and 70s under Pierre Trudeau. That then metastasizes. We go from multiculturalism, which is kind of a gateway drug, to critical race theory, settler colonialism, and all of the 2010s radicalism, which is just turning the dial up a notch. So it's now white privilege, white supremacy. You have the indigenous who are oppressed and colonized, and that whole kind of critical race theory stuff suddenly comes to the fore, where it had always been there, but it would always be in the shadows, only in certain academic departments. It didn't actually escape the laboratory of campus and really spread into the newspapers and into the culture the way it does in the 2010s because of social media, which allows those ideas from campus to get into the newspapers. And also newspapers and media shifted to a clickbait model, which meant they were all about driving emotions and not really about classified ads. All of those things really allowed this stuff to get into the mainstream. And so now you had DEI on steroids. You've got jobs limited to indigenous and black people, getting lighter sentences for the same crime, all this kind of stuff. But I think it's continuous with things that were being talked about in the politically correct multiculturalist 1980s. I actually think it's a continuous path. This kind of making sacred race, making sacred of sex and gender. It's just that the dial has been turned up and the spread is much more extensive than it was. So yeah, that's really where we are. And I do think those ideas have exhausted themselves. They've reached the end of the road, but they are so well entrenched, so established in Canadian institutions. And there's no force on the right, as there is in America, for example, that is able to scrape it out of the institutions. And until that happens, you will have this kind of almost zombie-like DEI just continuing to move through the schools, the teacher training, the health system, the universities, everywhere you look, civil service. Unless there is an active political intervention, this will continue. And so, yeah, I think that's just where Canada is. Now, of course, large-scale immigration was always related insofar as if you take that asymmetrical multiculturalist approach, you want to sort of, to the extent that majorities are bad and minorities are good, you want to have the majority eroded and minorities promoted. And therefore, immigration is one tool to do that. Multiculturalism is another tool to do that. DEI is another tool to do that. So I think this is all part of the same project. Now, of course, even without multiculturalism and asymmetrical multiculturalism, you probably would have had some diversification of the population for economic reasons. The immigration sources in Europe dried up. You undoubtedly would have also had some degree of diversification, but probably it's been accelerated by this ideology over the years. And I would just say that this idea that Canada somehow had this perfect immigration system prior to Justin Trudeau, I think, is nonsense. It was bad already. It was already at the top end of the OECD. It was vastly in excess of what was needed, but it's just that Trudeau just ramped it up to crazy levels. But I think taking it back to the way it was before Trudeau is not actually solving the problem. I mean, you actually have to put in a much, much bigger pause, I would argue, just to allow for the absorption of what's occurred in the past few decades. Otherwise, you're moving into a different type of society, which is more, again, I say more like Dubai, where you have, different bubbles rubbing along together fine, but existing in this very thin, lower trust culture. That's fine, but it's a different type of country.
Oh yeah, the Tallow Truth. I've been using their products for at least 2 years now. It's all beef tallow skincare. I honestly love everything they have. I got hooked on their flagship skin cream F-Bomb. Then I found out they had a sunscreen substitute, and it's awesome. I even use it on my kids. And then in one of my orders, they included like this lip chap. And I don't know about you, but I'm like a lip chap essentialist. I know that's not a real thing. But anyway, I'm now addicted to their mint tallow lip chap. Then they came out with this product called the Freedom Face Whip. Dude, it's literally the nicest thing I've ever put on my skin. And now they have a soap. So yeah, the Tallow Truth is what's up. I literally put that on everything.
And I agree that it's been a decades long in the making, because my mind was quite blown whenever I started digging into the history of both the Cold War, Maoist style indoctrination, and also just how these ideas and essentially ideological subversion found their way into the West. And I mean, it makes complete sense whether you are China or whether you're the Soviet Union at the time. that if you see yourself as in a battle between nations, then, you know, there's obviously the military element, there's the economic element that are more forward facing, but then you can also play the cultural element. And there's a fantastic book by Eugene Lyons about the 1930s in America. And it's called The Red Decade, and where he was actually a communist in America. And then he slowly came to the realization that he was actually just being weaponized against America by the Soviet Union, and all of these social movements and community groups and stuff were really just outposts of the Soviet Union. And I mean, even in regards to Canada as well, Sam Cooper did an excellent piece on how one of Zhou Enlai's, who was in Mao's inner cabinet, how one of his right-hand men was actually studying at UBC with Pierre Trudeau, and how he that was actually, Zhou Enlai talks about how that was his first success at ideologically subverting a foreign politician, and was Pierre Trudeau. And so it's also, like, I think there is a domestic organic growth, but I also think that there's probably a geopolitical kind of weaponization of these style of ideologies in terms of that. Do you see, like, how would you see those two elements? How much of this is organic? How much of it do you think is say strategy by outside forces to weaken a nation that they see as opposition?
My own view, I mean, there are different views on this. My view, to be honest, is that the outside forces are not very important in this story. I think they will certainly make use, you know, if Canada's beating itself up over some kind of so-called genocide that it committed against the natives, and then Canada goes to censure China over its treatment of the Uyghurs, of course, China's going to wheel out, you know, that native genocide, so-called, naturally. I mean, you know, so I think they're certainly going to make use of own goals that Canada is committing against itself. But I'd say in terms of the motivation for this, I don't think the outside really matters much. I think this is sort of a homegrown development, really. You know, I guess, you know, there's kind of two ways of looking at the rise of woke. I mean, one is more the James Lindsay, Chris Rufo, and even Francis Fukuyama approach that see it as a top-down march through the institutions, more deliberate and intentional. And I'm not saying that stuff didn't occur, but I think the bigger thing is more a bottom-up, like a spreading of a mind virus, like a COVID, and it hits super spreaders like universities, and it gets passed to more people, and there are more people who truly believe in this thing. I think that is really sort of the way I would see it. And also you have the virus that can mutate, it can kind of metastasize, and more virulent strains can emerge. I mean, I think that's the way to think about this. Now, yes, of course, it is true that there were Marxists who realized, oh, the working class in the West isn't interested in revolution, so we've got to look to the third world, we got to look to blacks in the inner cities and other racial, sexual minorities to carry on some kind of radical transformation. You know, that is the Herbert Marcuse thing. And yes, that did happen. I'm not saying that didn't happen, but I don't think that's the main reason we are where we are. I think, and I guess Pierre Trudeau, who moved in these kind of quasi-socialist circles, not fully Marxist, was sort of the new left. I mean, the new left was pivoting away from class to race and identity, and that's sort of where I see Pierre Trudeau as part of that movement. You could almost say Leninism, Lennon, like John Lennon, Imagine There's No Countries, right? It's this kind of soft leftism as opposed to Leninism of the hard left, Lenin, right? So I think Trudeau is more the Lennonism. And that new left is so intellectually that's what's happening. But I think that bigger force, and the reason you see corporations, for example, bringing in DEI, even as far back, by the way, as the 70s and 80s, is that there wasn't really a contradiction between being a capitalist and being a cultural leftist. The cultural leftism works pretty well. And it comes out of this kind of humanitarian, ultra bleeding heart orientation, which is there also in liberalism, not just in socialism. And is associated with Christianity, or certain strands of mainline Christianity. I think that is really where a lot of this comes through, and it comes through mainline Protestantism, for example, this emphasis on harm protection, including now emotional harm protection, emotional safety, emotional trauma, microaggression, trigger warning, all that kind of stuff is coming out of this humanitarian psychotherapy, which is not really a socialist tradition. And I think that's really the bigger force in all this. And this is what I argue in my book, Taboo. And I think that really explains Canada. You know, Canada is really a blend of what I would call progressive neoliberalism. They want capitalism. Actually, you know, they're fine with economic development, with, you know, skyscrapers and highways and everything, but they want to be radical on the cultural left stuff, the multiculturalism, the sexual, racial, anything around the holy trinity of race, gender, and sexuality is almost got that totemic status, and that's what defines the country. So that progressive neoliberalism is, I think, the philosophy across the West. I think Canada exemplifies it perhaps more than other societies, because there wasn't an established, I mean, the conservative tradition was destroyed with the end of the British Empire in Canada. So without any effective conservative tradition, the left was able to remake Canada in its own image more completely than was the case in other countries. Britain has a more established conservative tradition. You might say some countries like Ireland, for example, there is a conservative tradition there too, yes, but I think that the delegitimizing of the Catholic Church over the scandals and the sexual abuse scandals also pulled the rug out from Irish conservatism, which is one reason why Ireland has gone so crazy as well. But I think Canada is an example of that. To some degree, Australia and New Zealand are as well, where loss of empire really removes the prop of cultural conservatism from those societies, allowing the cultural left to really, really drive society in its direction, much more so than perhaps it did in other parts of the West.
And actually, this maybe leads into the last thing that I'd really be interested in getting your opinion on, is because, you know, you mentioned about the essentially a counterculture, a conservative counterculture, and how that's definitely popping up now in America. And earlier on, you were mentioning how there's kind of these two different views when it comes to, say, a defensive approach to culture. More actually, I really like Orwell's distinction as well on this, about, you know, how there's, when it comes to nationalism and patriotism, there's a shield, and then there's also a sword. And it seems to me that the younger generation now, like the say 25 and under, is definitely trying to go more and more and getting more appeal out of that sword, because, you know, they're sitting there going, well, you know, we tried for the last 10 years to kind of up our shield, and you said that we were, you know, just kept tossing every label you possibly could at us. And now you're seeing the rise in like massive popularity of people like Nick Fuentes, who are just openly on an aggressive stance against it. Like, what do you make about that shift in movement, where it does seem like it's becoming more offensive now than defensive?
Well, I guess I would caution, and I would say that I wouldn't read too much into the Fuentes phenomenon, for example. I'm actually just in the middle of doing a survey and trying to get a sense of how many, say, young people on the right in the U.S. Tune into Nick Fuentes. It's relatively small, and his effect on attitudes is relatively modest. I don't think that this is a major force in the culture. It might affect a couple of percent at the margins. I think it's been overblown in the media. There's kind of a moral panic around. Partly he's a shock jock and entertainer. Partly people like conspiracies. Similarly with Candace Owens, it was very interesting to see, you know, Fuentes sort of saying, you know, Candace Owens he's almost criticizing conspiracy theory now. So it's kind of very fascinating. But I just think all that stuff is froth, really. I think the more important developments are to do with the rise of, you know, mass-based populist right parties, you know, Reform on 30%, you know, Bardella and the RN looking like they're going to attain the presidency. So we could see Bardella in France Farage in Britain, the AfD in Germany, the Sweden Democrats in Sweden. Really, those shifts, and of course the Trump phenomenon, possibly with Vance as the heir to that tradition in the U.S., is essentially being much less willing to be cowed by the charge of racism. Now, of course, some stuff is racism, like, what Fuentes is saying on his program, so that you still need to have that charge out there. But I think the fact that it's been so overused, I think now the right has acquired a certain immunity in the U.S. Now in Canada, I still think there is more trepidation. We're only starting to see the first shoots. Polyev is braver than he was. He's not where the U.S. right is. But he's willing to go to places that he wouldn't have been willing to go in the past, the places that, quite frankly, needed to be talked about. The levels of immigration, the share of foreign-born in the country being, is that really compatible with the kind of society you want? And now in British Columbia, the first politicians being willing to sort of go after the myth of the residential school genocide, for example. And some politicians like Daniel Smith had gone after the trans issue, and so that Higgs in New Brunswick was the first one, and a number of others, Scott Moe in Saskatchewan. So there is the beginning of a pushback against the progressive, essentially progressive lies that you had to believe in, whether it be around, sex and gender, or whether it's around the Indigenous. That's starting to be tackled, but only in a more modest way. I think it's going to be interesting to see, but I think what's happened is there's been a shift in conservatism itself away from what was known as fusionism. So muscular foreign policy, low tax, family values. That's now shifting towards a more national conservatism, which is about actually defense of the culture, defense of traditions of nationhood. That is now legitimate to talk about, immigration, legitimate to talk about in a way that really wasn't the case. The Republican Party of the Bush era, really had almost a sort of consensus that we aren't going to touch affirmative action. Really, we're not going to campaign hard on immigration and illegal immigration even. That was the consensus, and that was disrupted by Trump. Just the way, by the way, the Sweden Democrats disrupted a consensus in Sweden when they talked about immigration levels in 2014. And once they disrupted that consensus, all the other parties followed them because everyone knew that actually this was a problem. It's just that they were no longer bound by the taboo anymore. And then that's happened, to some extent in Canada over the immigration issue, which you could never talk about, actually. When I was growing up, it was you'd get the racist label. So actually things have improved, at least in that narrow issue. On that issue, I think things are probably better in the past year in Canada than they've ever been since I've been alive, really.
Yeah, it's interesting to think back even to the whole, Don Cherry Poppy scandal and how like that minor of a comment got such backlash at the time. And then, now more and more. And I think too, when you were talking about the whole Fuentes phenomenon and kind of stuff on the online world, it is really interesting. I feel like the real world and the online world are diverging more and more significantly because you go talk to people that aren't, super tapped in the online world and they have no idea about what's happening in, say, those circles. But then you look at the online world and it's like, that's everything. You would think that would be in every single person's head across the nation. And so it is very interesting to see that kind of that divergence in how, that gap is widening. Anything else you'd like to add today, or where our listeners can go find your work or more books, lecture series, all of that kind of stuff?
Yeah, I mean, I'm on X. It's at EPKAUFM. I have an open online university course on woke, by the way, which some of your listeners might be interested in. It's my pinned tweet, and it's you can access the content for only about $100. So it's kind of that's mainly what I'm about. I mean, I got various other activities, but I've got a YouTube channel as well. But mainly, I would say X is the main way, as well as things that I publish, which also wind up on X as well. So, otherwise, it's been a pleasure, Liam, and good
beautiful.
with the show.
Yeah, we'll make sure to include all of those links and stuff in the description for this show. And I thank you very much for sitting down and chatting with us. Like I said, I've been taking your lectures, and I've very, very much enjoyed your perspective. So yeah, thanks for taking the time today.
Okay, all the best. Say hi to Canada for me too.
Will do. Thanks for watching, everyone, and we'll catch you next time.